Hello world, I'm Whitney Bandel and welcome to another video from my HTML and CSS course. In this video we will be looking at structure and formatting. So if you take a look at the week 2 module, I have a bunch of different links that we're going to be going and taking a look at. Some of them we'll be looking at in this video, and some of them you will be required to look at on your own time. So first we're going to take a look at this PowerPoint. So instead of working with code in this video, we're actually going to be looking at design choices and how they can influence how you put together your websites. So a couple of different ways for you to organize your sitemap, which we talked a little bit about in the last video, is to organize your navigation in a couple different ways. So you can see in the first picture, this method is called linear. In this sort of navigation, each of the links go directly to each other back and forth. One example of how you might use a linear type of sitemap would be if you were following an instructional guide where there was a clear process for moving from one point to a second point and so on. You could also think of this as perhaps a part of a website where you are purchasing something and you need to be walked through a very particular process where you don't want to access any of the rest of the site. The next picture is hierarchical, which is going to group information based off of a hierarchy of what's most important and most broad to what's more specific. So in the top here we have the home page, presumably, and then these break down into two different pages, and then these break down further into more and more specific information. This is going to be the most common. Here in the third picture we have nonlinear, and this goes along with this idea over here for random. It's going to be more interactive. It could be more of an artistic website that's looking more at a particular type of experience. It can be a little bit more confusing for users to try to find their way around the site. So you don't want to make it too complex, or you just want to take into consideration the appropriate way to use it. So the last image demonstrates how most websites aren't going to just be one of these types. They're going to be a bit of everything. So here we might have a couple of random links going back to the homepage. We might have a linear path. For example, like I said, if somebody is filling out a particular form or process. And then here we might have a hierarchy of breaking down information into more specific areas. A common idea for considering in design, and this comes from more traditional design practices, such as newspapers, is the idea of above the fold. And this usually has kind of eye-catching graphics that are going to be seen right on the top of a page. So with newspapers, it was having eye-catching graphics, headlines, when the paper was folded, and then you would unfold the paper and you would see the rest of the information. So kind of a similar idea is having a really eye-catching graphic at the top of your page and then having more information when you scroll. A lot of times websites will have hero images, which will take up a good portion of the top of the page and then kind of give you a good idea of what is going to follow later on. So this breaks down a couple of different types of modern navigation menus. So a couple of terms to be familiar with: navigation bar, breadcrumb, graphics for navigation, dynamic navigation, site index. And I have a link here that goes over 10 types of modern navigation menus. So you can look at this more on your own. I have these linked in Canvas for you to look at. We're just going to kind of browse through. So, hamburger menu button. So this you're probably familiar with, especially on mobile devices, and that's this little menu of 3 lines. Sometimes you'll see them as dots, but the idea is that you would click on it and another menu might pop up or slide in from the side and give you your items, and then when you aren't looking at it, you can minimize that information so it's out of the way. So as we can see here, this is navigation that's scattered around the perimeter of the welcome section looks fresh and original. It can also be a little bit confusing. Users are used to reading navigation either on the top or on the left, and so they might not know that this information is a link. They might think that it's more artistic and it's just decorative. Here we have full screen multimedia based navigation. So here it looks like these images are the actual links. And so if you clicked anywhere on them, it would take you to these particular areas. Interactive navigation, interactive videos, virtual walks, static scenes spiced up with dynamic features. So you might have more of an interactive experience where you're actually just kind of watching a video, walking you through. There might be different navigation items to click occasionally, slide out menu. So this usually will be combined with that hamburger menu. So this is what one might look like. Looks like there's a hamburger menu over here that you would click on, and this slides out. Static sidebar navigation. So if you don't have a navigation on the top, usually you'll have the navigation on the left. So here we have a streamlined nav bar, and it's quite popular. And here they're suggesting that you should have no more than 7 items. And that's a good rule of thumb for any sort of navigation, just so that way you don't have so many items that it becomes confusing. Massive drop-down menus. These are something that you might see on a news website or perhaps a giant database type website like Amazon where they have tons of different information. Here's an example of what that might look like. Footer navigation. And we're going to talk more about this in later videos, but a lot of times it's really helpful to have navigation in your footer, especially when you're working with mobile designs. So that way people don't have to scroll all the way back to the top in order to be able to navigate. And it actually looks like in this example that the buttons here are going to be a navigation, and then the rest of the items are actually at the bottom. So they're kind of removing the top navigation. Here's navigation to Parallax powered websites. Absence of navigation. And then they're calling this original navigation. This is, again, a little bit more of a non-traditional look. It looks like these signs would link to different areas. So I would suggest not doing this for every project, but if done appropriately, like here we have these big fonts, there's really obvious borders around them. There's nothing else on the page to confuse the text with. So somebody could pretty easily figure out what they need to do, even though it is less traditional. Alright, so navigation bar just being the navigation that you would see at the top of a page. Breadcrumb navigation. This is the type of navigation that you would see on a site like Amazon. Here's a picture of what that might look like. So in this example, this would be a breadcrumb navigation that you would be following while you are purchasing something. So walking you through those different steps, so you could go back to a previous step. A lot of times you'll also see the sort of navigation if you are looking for a particular product. Let's say you were looking for a laptop. You might start by looking up electronics and then computers, and then from computers specifying that you want laptops, and then if you wanted to travel back to a previous category, you could follow this breadcrumb trail. Graphics for navigation, that's just using different actual icon buttons for your navigation instead of just having the text. Dynamic navigation would be an example. That would be a drop-down menu. And then a lot of times it can be really helpful to include a site index so that people can use wayfinding in order to figure their way around. So something that I'm going to have you consider in this class is how to design for fluid layouts. In the past, when people were designing for websites, there were much fewer options for how the websites were going to be presented, and CSS wasn't as advanced. So a lot of times websites were designed to have fixed dimensions. So in the left picture, you can see that each of these has a particular dimension. These are measured in pixels. And now that we are looking at websites on a huge variety of different types of platforms, we're looking at websites on tablets, on mobile devices. You might be looking at websites on your video game consoles. You might be able to access some websites on other types of devices, maybe even in your car. There's a lot of different ways that we are interacting with the internet. So it's a lot harder for people to anticipate what those dimensions are going to actually be and to design for them. So we as a whole are moving towards working with fluid layouts. So in this example on the right, rather than having a fixed dimension where everything has to be a particular size, instead we're looking more at percentages and ratios. And a lot of times when you have a design that is made to essentially stretch and move around with a particular size of the window, you will have different types of styles. So you might have a style range that is aimed more at desktop, and then you might have a style range that is aimed more at mobile. So that way you're not having to make one layout fit all of the different possible layouts. You could have one that's going to have 2 columns, and then as you shrink it down into a smaller size, it's going to go into a single column. So this idea you'll often hear called responsive web design. So there's a couple of terms you might hear: fluid layout, liquid layout, responsive web design. They're all looking at the idea of designing for flexibility, being able to change things. So the idea that we can go from a large desktop version to tablet to mobile. So here I have a link to the w3schools.com's look at responsive web design. Responsive web design makes your web page look good on all devices. Responsive web design uses only HTML and CSS. So they have these different pictures which I used for the slideshow. So looking at desktop, tablet, and phone. So part of the idea is simplifying down information. So here we might have a navigation and a sidebar, and then our main content, and then in the tablet view we might move this sidebar to the bottom and start stacking our column information. And then here we might change how our navigation is going to be accessed, so that way it's not taking up valuable screen space. So when people were first starting to design for mobile, a lot of times they would either take a desktop website and try to simplify it down into a mobile version, or they would make 2 completely different experiences, with one website being primarily focused on just desktop features, and then completely different experience for mobile. Now a lot of people are working with mobile first design, and the idea behind mobile first design is that you're going to first design for your mobile device, and this helps allow designers to focus what is most important. Oftentimes, when you're working from desktop first, you're cutting away features and removing content and trying to figure out what needs to be there or not. And sometimes you feel attached to content, or you might choose the wrong type of content. If you're starting with mobile, you're making sure that you are considering what is going to be most essential, and those things are going to be just as essential when you are looking at the desktop version. So it's trying to give a different perspective so that way you are thinking about creating the most streamlined experience possible, and then just adding screen space as you are moving from tablet to desktop. Nowadays, a lot of designers are actually moving away from mobile first. There's a little bit of push back and forth on whether or not you should work with mobile first, but I would definitely recommend considering working with mobile first to at least consider what is going to be most essential and what could be extraneous content that you don't necessarily need on any of the three different platforms. A lot of times people get confused with exactly what aesthetics are, and aesthetics can be really important when you are creating your designs. So I have here the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of what an aesthetic is. It's a branch of philosophy that explores the nature of art, beauty, and taste with the creation and appreciation of beauty. So I think this can be a little bit misleading. Here we already see a couple of words such as beauty. I think taste is a really good word for describing it. Here I have philosopher Dennis Dutton's identified 6 universal signatures in human aesthetics. So the 6 categories are expertise or virtuosity. Humans cultivate, recognize, and admire technical artistic skill. So we recognize something that must have taken a lot of work and a lot of mastery. Non-utilitarian pleasure. People enjoy art for art's sake. Style, artistic objects and performances satisfy rules of composition that place them in a recognizable style. Criticism. People make a point of judging, appreciating, and interpreting works of art. So being able to talk about something, even if it's controversial. Imitation, with a few important exceptions like abstract painting. Works of art simulate experience of the world so people can relate to it. Special focus, art is set aside from ordinary life and made a dramatic focus of experience. So these are different types of universal signatures of human aesthetics, reasons why we might connect to different types of designs. Now, I think that aesthetics are often focused too much on this idea of something being visually pleasing and beautiful. So here I have a couple of examples of how someone can connect to something that isn't beautiful, but can still be visually interesting and visually appealing in some way. So these are 3 different posters, and they all are kind of more of, I'm not going to say the horror genre. They're more dramatic, they're a little bit chilling, they have kind of more putrid colors, but they are still very good designs. They feel very balanced, they have very dynamic colors, um, they're really powerful in how they are presented, and they really are eye-catching. So you can be visually drawn to something and interested in it, even if you don't find it beautiful. I also want to advise you to be aware of this idea of style. A lot of times, designers get caught up in how things look, and it's more important for you to focus on the function first. And then once you have the function down, the structure, then you can start thinking about form. You can create a very beautiful design, but if users can't figure out how it works and can't use it, then it's not going to be helpful at all. Everybody has different personal preferences. A couple of different things that you want to consider is layout, color, graphics, fonts, as well as other items. When you're creating designs, you want to think about who your audience is. You will often create personas, and personas reflect who your target audience is. Depending on your target audience, you'll want to design your website differently. Personas aren't real people, they're not actual people, but they are developed as sort of templates to represent who your demographics are. So if you are doing marketing research and you are figuring out the typical age range, the typical um, lifestyle, the typical internet usage of your users, you're going to compile that information into different types of personas and then do usability testing based off those personas to make sure that you are designing for their needs. So when you are creating a design, you want to consider universal design, which takes into account these four things. Is it perceivable? So a couple things you can do to make your website more perceivable on a universal level is add text descriptions to your images. Once we start looking at multimedia, we'll talk about creating alternative text. You'll also want to add captions to your videos, and you want to create transcripts of your audios so that way people have an alternative method for being able to gather the information that's represented in those mediums. The next category is operable. So you want to consider how somebody is creating input into their computer. Are they using a mouse or a keyboard? Some people might be only using a keyboard for operating the whole website. So you want to think about how they might be able to move across your website without a mouse. Is your website understandable? Is it easy to read? Does it have helpful error messages? You probably all have filled out a form before where there was no indication that a particular field in the form needed to be required, and yet when you went to submit it, it gave you an error and you couldn't find which part of the form that it was wanting to be filled out. So being able to give people information is really important. Robust, written to standards, also helpful if taking into account old technology. So you want to make sure that your website validates that it is written appropriately. This also will help with your search engine optimization. This is what search engines like Google use in order to rank websites and figure out how trustworthy they are. So the more that your website follows different standards, the higher it's going to rank. So here I have a couple of videos that I want you to watch. I'll let you do that in your own time. These are going to be linked on Canvas. These are going to be linked on Canvas under this section called Universal Design. Alright, so this is an activity that I normally do in class, face-to-face classes. So I'm going to make this a little different. Normally what I do is I have everyone divide into partners and come up with a website that has horrible design. Instead, I'm going to have you do this on your own, and I'm going to have you post to a discussion thread on Canvas and share your website and a bit of a description of what you think is wrong with the design of the site. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of websites that I think have poor design. The first one is the one that I showed in this slide, which is weather.com. I find their website to feel very cluttered and disorganized. They have a really nice navigation at the top, and you can find information that you want, but it's not readily apparent to you at the beginning. If you just go to the first page, they have just tons and tons of videos and ads, and it all feels sort of haphazard. Locally, they sort of line up with each other, but if you scroll through, you start noticing that They don't necessarily make sense. I can't really tell what the purpose of these all are. Here we have an ad. Here we have different items that are supposedly trending. Finally, we have a map that shows the actual United States. I would like to see this at the top, where if I am interested in whether that's developing, I want to know what's going on, or maybe I want to know what's going on in another part of the country, I'd like to see this at the top rather than these ads and different information. Here on the right, I have more ads. It's a little unclear what these mean. Stay up to date. And you'll notice too that as we kind of scroll down, none of these actually stay lined up with each other. This doesn't line up here. This also doesn't line up. Everything is kind of a different size. Here we have a bunch of different ads. Here we have another line. These are recommended. I can't really tell what they are. Are they pictures? Are they videos? I guess they're photos. Here we have our photo gallery pics, which I'm not sure why do they think I want to look at these. It's unclear what the motivation is. We have another ad here. I can't really tell what these are. Are these on different sites? More information. It's just tons and tons and tons of different sorts of videos and filler, and it's really hard to tell, is any of this actually relevant to me? Are these things actually hosted on weather.com? Are they all just links going to websites somewhere else? It all just looks like a bunch of clickbait. And then finally we get to the bottom and there's this nice little footer, but I feel like we really don't need any of this. We could just have a nice page that shows that map, maybe a couple of trending articles, an ad or two, and we wouldn't really need to go beyond maybe this distance. There's way too much information and it's hard to see what we actually want. Alright, so another site that you might be familiar with if you live in Johnson County is the Johnson County website. This is another one that I find to be quite confusing, and part of it is because it is a governmental website and it covers a huge spectrum of different needs and services and different branches. And so if you browse through, you can kind of see it's really difficult to find particular information. There's a lot of navigation menus, so there's kind of a navigation up here, social media. There's this nice search, but if you actually go to this website and you try to search something, it can actually be hard to find. A good search. So here I'm typing in driver's license, and my search results are catch a ride, frequent questions, title, IVD, support cases. So I can't tell if any of these are relevant. Maybe frequent questions. Here we have where is the office located. I can't even tell anymore. This is contractor licensing. That doesn't seem right. I don't know what a Title 4D support case is. That seems like it's not relevant. Catch a ride. This seems like something in the case if you don't have a driver's license. Maybe we could go to popular questions. Motor vehicles. And here again, it's a little confusing. We could maybe do what are DMV hours. And then here we just have this information. I still don't know how to get my driver's license. Where do I need to go? What do I need to do? So I would suggest look through here, see if you can find anything else that is a little bit confusing, hard to find. This is a website that I often have students look at and kind of pick apart and try to see what they can come up with that isn't as user friendly as it could maybe be. So, when you are thinking about creating a design, again, I want you to think about the different platforms that you might be using. A lot of times when we think of different platforms, we'll think of desktop, tablet, and mobile, but there are a lot of other ways that we interact with the internet, whether it's through a web app or another device. You might use, for example, your DVD player, Blu-ray player to access Netflix. You might even use your television to access Netflix. You might use your video game consoles. You can even access internet through your car. There's even kitchen appliances these days that have at some point a bit of interactivity. It might not be the internet is what we are used to, but there's definitely a future for alternative devices. And you want to consider the information that you're creating, how people are going to interact with it, and what sort of devices are they going to use. An important question is, how do our devices see us? So if you can just think for a little bit, what do our devices know about us? If you think about your computer, how do we communicate with our computers? So this is a graphic that is created by Tom Igno and Dan O'Sullivan. And this is how the computer sees us from physical computing. And so in this graphic, we get an idea of the different types of inputs and outputs that are communicated through a computer. So we create inputs by touching, whether it's a touch screen, if we are clicking on a mouse or clicking on a keyboard. Usually we are touching something in order to create different types of input. We might be, something that's not shown on here would be a mouth audio. So if we were doing voice commands and we were talking into a device, this is a bit of an old graphic, so they don't have that. And then different types of output of how information is communicated back to us. Usually we can see the output. Maybe we are listening to something. The graphic has 2 ears because we are capable of having stereo audio. Maybe somebody is actually touching for their output. Maybe they have a braille reader device that's actually giving them physical output that they can actually feel. But you want to think about that, those inputs and those outputs of how we are communicating information. So when we're thinking about different platforms, when we talked about responsive design, I want you to consider this idea of the visual plane. And here I have a couple of examples. So variable, we no longer know the size or the physical characteristics of the field we design upon and the borders of our work. We need to consider that our designs need to be dynamic. We can never be entirely certain what browsers, operating systems, fonts, colors, or other foundational display technologies will be present to support the design. Ubiquitous. Designs are unbound from desks and have become truly environmental. This is something that's important to consider. We're no longer working at our desks in kind of a private environment. Somebody might be interacting with a website or an app on their phone, and they could be distracted by their environment. Maybe they're trying to complete a task while they are on a bus and there's a lot of noise around them. Maybe they don't have privacy. And so it can be important for you to think about the types of environments that people are going to be in. Responsive, fluid page grids, responsive images, and CSS3 media queries. We're going to talk more about media queries in the future, but the idea behind that is creating multiple sets of styles for the different types of dimensions and viewports. So having your styles for your phones, your styles for your desktop. Here I have a couple of examples again. Maybe somebody is accessing internet through a wearable device like their watch. Maybe somebody's accessing information through their center console on their cars, through a phone, through a computer. So here is a graphic that takes a look at different dimensions. Websites will look quite different depending on the browser's screen resolution or window. So these are kind of common dimensions to consider. Common desktop is 1366 by 768. And this is changing all the time. This is a more traditional kind of smaller size, but it's going to apply well. You can always design for this size and then create more margin space to kind of fill the rest of a window. So even if somebody has a larger size than this, it's better to design for smaller. You could always do another size that is made for even larger screens if you wanted to. Now, the mobile size, this is what I could find, 735 by 667. This is changing a lot now. A lot of newer smartphones have more pixels per inch, which allows them to have a much higher resolution size and a much smaller space than they used to have. This is a bit of a more older resolution size, so you want to take that into account as well. Tablet, 768 by 1024. And you also want to think about how it rotates, because somebody might want to access your website with a tablet in vertical mode, or they might want to access it in a horizontal mode. And this horizontal resolution actually works really well for older monitor sizes as well. So you could use that as a way to kind of reach two target audiences at the same time. So you might consider having a desktop dimension, a tablet horizontal and vertical view, and maybe even mobile vertical and horizontal views. So next you want to think about the visual structure, and this ties into the idea of visual hierarchy, how people will read through the website and figure out information. So the graphic on the left kind of shows how you can use information to catch somebody's eye. In the West, a lot of times we are used to reading information from left to right and top down, and so our websites are made in that manner. We're used to having a logo perhaps in the top left and then a navigation. So we'll often start in this top corner and then move across, and then we'll move down the left and kind of read headings and information as we go along. So this is a really good layout for how someone might want to read through the information. Someone might start here in the logo, read across, move down, kind of scan for different headings, move down again, and then scan, kind of move on through. So here are different ways that you can actually create visual hierarchy. So you can use size to make information stand out. You can use contrast, and there's a lot of different ways to create contrast, whether it's through color, value. Here there's different types of font and size to create contrast. Layout, so how you have your items arranged on the page. Color, so using different colors. Symmetry, so symmetry can help make your page feel balanced and create structure. Unity, finding ways to make the page feel united. If you have too much variety, it can be really overwhelming and confusing. So you want to make sure that your pages feel like they're united and they're harmonious. Space. Space is really important. A lot of times I've seen students neglect space. They're so focused on the content that they don't think about how much space should be between the content. So you want to make sure that you allow enough space between items to make them easy to differentiate, and then also to create organization that makes sense. Similarity. Grouping kind of goes along with that idea of space. You'll often hear the term proximity, and depending on how close something is, it can either feel like it's associated with it, or if you create enough space, it'll feel like it's part of its own unique group. So here's kind of more visuals going into some of these ideas. So contrast, you can use colors to create contrast. You can use different tones or value depending on how light or dark something is, size or shape, the direction it's moving in. Here are a couple different types of alignment. So alignment can be a really great way to organize your information to make it make sense. If you think back to that example of the weather.com website, there wasn't very good alignment across the whole page, and so it was hard to tell what information was connected to each other. Locally, it did a pretty good job where there would maybe be 3 videos in a row or 3 links in a row that would feel connected, but overall the site felt really random. Repetition, so using the same types of elements throughout the whole page, this helps create cohesion. Proximity, so thinking about how much space again is left between items to create different types of groupings. And again, white space is your friend. Here's some examples of really good designs which feel really empty, but they actually, or I should say, they have a lot of white space, and you would think that they feel empty, but they actually feel complete. And it's because they have really good balance to them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be actual white space. Here we have black filling up the background, and it's still filling it up. So you can still add color and have other things, but just thinking about how much space you have between items, how you're balancing out the whole page as a composition. This is a really great book, Making and Breaking the Grid. This is more for traditional types of design, like print media, but this can be a really great way for you to start thinking about how you organize information and how you have it relate to other information on the same page. So this idea of looking at grids first and foremost, there's a website called 960 Grid System. It's 960.gs, and this is a really great website for looking at the idea of columns and working with a grid to see how items break down. So they have a bunch of different website examples. And if you click on these buttons, show grid, it actually creates lines that move down, and it shows how these grids actually align across the whole page. See if I can zoom in a little bit. Now, I like to recommend 12 columns is a really great place to start. 12 divides down into 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so you could have a page where we have columns of 3, and then we can also have columns of smaller groupings. Let's see if we can find another one. This one's interesting. We have kind of 2 columns, and it divides also into 3 columns, but it still feels very balanced. This is kind of similar. We essentially kind of have 2 images, so it gives the illusion of 2 columns, and then we have 4 icons going across, and then kind of 2 sets of 3. But again, even though these aren't lining up with each other, we still have a very strong structure because everything's lining up with these columns. Here again, everything's kind of broken. We have one hero image that's going across, and then we have essentially 2 columns that can break down into 2 more if they need to, or the information can move all the way across. So this is where creating your wireframe can be really helpful to start off your design and have an idea of what you want to do before you even start coding. If you're more of a designer, you can actually do a lot of this in programs. You could work in Photoshop or Illustrator, and you can actually create grid guidelines that can show you how you can actually break down your page before maybe you hand it off to a developer. Or you could work with a program like Extra or Adobe XD. So thinking about ways to break down the page, a common idea that you will hear is creating items so they follow the idea of rule of thirds. So a lot of times designs will feel very static. If you had, for example, let's say this biker was instead just right in the very center of the page, it would feel balanced, but it would be less interesting visually. So a lot of times you'll want to have your designs follow, essentially lining up with these third lines. So you can divide up your page into third horizontally and vertically. So here what's interesting is we have the biker is kind of lining up with this third, and then we have him facing towards this point here, and we get this dramatic line going across the page in a triangle that is bringing your attention to essentially the destination of where he's traveling to. So this makes for a very dynamic and interesting visual. So you don't necessarily have to have your columns be completely balanced and symmetrical. You can still create balanced with a composition that is kind of tilted like this, where we have this triangle, and still have it very appealing. Another rule you can follow is the golden ratio, which breaks down information. So here we have this where we're breaking this down into smaller and smaller pieces that follow the golden ratio. So there's a couple of different ways to think about color. So there are different types of color scales, and we're going to be looking at each of these. So when you are working with RGB, you have a scale of color from 0 to 255. This gives you 256 values. So this is including 0 as the very first one. Hexadecimal values, these are often used with code. You might use these more. These are going to use numbers and letters to choose what your colors are. So an example of that would be FFF, FFF, which is white. Double check your colors are web safe. This guarantees that people are looking at the color you actually want. So certain colors might not actually be web safe, and with all the different devices and people's ability to change what their monitors look like, it might actually be hard to figure out what the actual color you are using looks like. And so you might have colors that you think look really well together, but then on a customer's computer it might actually look quite awful. So you want to make sure that you are actually working with the right colors that you think you are, and then also double check to see that they are web safe. Use contrast for text color to make it easier to read. Think of what is easy to read when you are tired. And so here I have a couple of different links to websites where you can create different color palettes. So we're going to take a look at this. So if you go to week 2, we're just kind of moving through these different links. If you go to choosing color palettes, these can be really helpful when you're first starting out working with color. Maybe you're a little intimidated, you're not really sure where to start. So this first website, CSS Drive, has a colors palette generator where you can browse and upload a file, and then it will come up with different color palettes for you to use based off this color. A lot of times we are drawn to the colors that are found in nature, and so uploading a picture of imagery from nature, it can actually be a really great way to find a naturally appealing color palette. So here we have some light color choices, some medium color choices, dark choices. Here's a complete color palette, and you can kind of pick and choose different colors that you might want to. So that's one method. Here we have colors on the web. This will actually calculate based off of a hexadecimal color. So here there's one already, and we have different color schemes. So analogous, these are all going to be colors that are going to be in the kind of same color section of the color wheel. So they're all really similar to each other. So here you'll see there's just very slight differences. We have our original color, then we have one that's just slightly off one direction, one that's slightly off another way, and then white to kind of balance off. And then complementary, these are going to be colors that are going to be on exact opposite sides of the color wheel. These usually complement each other very well. There is going to be certain instances where complementary colors might clash with each other. For example, red and green are on the opposite side of the color wheel, and they can look really well together, but depending on the particular hue of red and green, you can actually find combinations that clash a lot with each other. So you want to think about the different color choices you're making. Split complementary. These are going to take one color and then go across the color wheel from it, and then just move a little bit from one side to the other. So rather than having just this color of kind of a purple, instead we're getting a slightly more blue purple, and then we're getting a slightly more red kind of pink color. Monochromatic, these are all going to be colors that have that same hue of green. It's just a matter of how bright of green it is, how dark of green it is, but they're all going to be that same hue, and then it's just going to be a matter of how much white, black, or gray is added to it. Triadic, these are going to be colors that are equally spaced to create kind of a triangle on the color wheel. And then tetradic would be 4 different colors equally spaced away from each other on the color wheel. You can also think of this as 2 sets of complementary colors. So here we'd have the green and the kind of purple pink would be a set of complementary colors, and then the blue and orange would be a set of complementary colors. And then here we have a couple of color variations. So maybe this color is sort of what you want, and then it gives you some different suggestions of different hue variations. So hue being the actual color on the color wheel. Saturation variations, so choosing how intense the color is going to be. Tint and shade variation, so these are going to be how much black or white is added to it to make it lighter or darker. So this is Peloton.com, and this has a nice interactive interface. So when we're talking about the color wheel, this is what we mean with choosing different colors, whether it's more in the green spectrum, red. So this allows us to kind of move around. What I like is we have a couple of interactive options. So we have being able to choose the hue. Here we can click on this and it's going to give us 3 different options, so we can choose 3 different colors. This would be a triadic, so we'd have 3 colors equally spaced apart, and this shows us different colors over here which we can save. Here we could actually choose a tetradic, so if we had two sets of complementary colors where we have 4 equally spaced apart, looks about right. And then here we have different options for choosing, do we want everything to be kind of the same intensity, or do we want to add more contrast? And then you can kind of choose if you want it to be more saturated, so you'll see there's more of an intense orange, versus if we go over here there's less intensity. It's essentially more grayed out, kind of a duller color. And the different setting options, and one of the sites I like the most, and I use this a lot with Adobe software, you can save these and bring them in to work with. So Adobe has this color option. So kind of same thing as that last one we looked at, we can choose different types of color harmonies. So analogous are going to be colors that are all close to each other. So even if I move this around, they're all going to move around. So we can pick a bunch of colors in kind of the red-orange range. We could pick a bunch of colors kind of that are blue. So this gives us different options. You could have a couple that are going to be a little bit lighter. You have some that are going to be darker. And what's nice is you can click on the color wheel. You have these colors down here, but we can also modify these a little bit and change some of these settings if we wanted to. Here we can look at monochromatic. So monochromatic is all the same hue. It's just how close they are to the center. So we could have a bunch of different values. They'll all be that same hue of this red color, but then it'll just be a matter of how light it is, if they're a duller or brighter color. Here's triadic again. So having 3 different values, we might have a couple that are analogous within this range, and then the rest are evenly spaced. Complementary, so being across from the color wheel with each other. And like I said, sometimes complementary colors can work with each other, but there will be times where they might start looking a little bit garish with each other. For example, I think this is one color combination where some of these don't necessarily look as good with each other. Maybe if we tweaked it a little bit where we're not quite choosing a particular, maybe instead of this particular type of green that's really bright, maybe if we switched it up a little bit so it was a little different, and maybe would look a little bit better with these. Compound, so being able to kind of choose from a slightly different set. This kind of adds a little bit of variety, but it's still sort of controlled because we do have kind of essentially 2 analogous groups where these are all kind of close to each other, these are pretty close to each other. I actually think this can make pretty good combinations. It's just a matter of tweaking them. Shades, so just choosing, again, the same hue, but different shades from that hue. And then custom. And then what I like is, so this is create. We also have explore. So it looks like this is the color of the year. You can often scroll through the explore section and find different palettes. Normally there's a bit more variety. Alright, these are looking a little bit different. So you could actually browse through, you could add to library, you could download. Sometimes you can actually go and click on these and actually edit them as well and kind of tweak them a little bit. You can extract from image as well. So that's a couple of ways how you can work with color. For your midterm project, you will be required to come up with a color palette. So there are a couple of ways to think about color. If you have done a lot of maybe drawing and painting in the past, the way that you combine color is going to be quite different than how you combine color and think of it with screen devices that use light. So there's kind of 2 different types of color wheels. There's additive, which combines towards white. So this is what we're going to be working with, is red, green, and blue. And then if you are used to working with paint, you might be familiar with subtractive, which dilutes towards black. So here you would work with magenta, cyan, and yellow. This is actually the color scheme that you would use if you were making something print friendly as well. So some common terms that you will hear, like you heard me talking about color wheel a lot. So here's an example of a color wheel where we have our primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. The ones we're going to work with for light are going to be red, green, and blue. But this gives you kind of an idea of how the colors relate to each other, if they are primary, secondary, or tertiary. You'll often hear RGB. This is going to be red, green, and blue. So if you have worked with maybe Photoshop or something before, you maybe have worked with these sliders where you're kind of choosing how much red you might have, how much green, how much blue you might have. And then there's another type of way of organizing information, which is putting every single value on a hue slider, so every hue that would go all the way around the circle, and then choosing how saturated it is. And saturation is different than brightness. It's kind of the intensity, so how pure the color is. So the closer it gets to the end, it's the most pure of that color, so being kind of the reddest red possible. And then if you move away from it, it moves more towards being gray. So that would be more of a duller color. And then lightness and darkness would be how light or dark it is. So is it a lighter color or darker color? So saturation and lightness are quite different from each other, but they're a little bit confusing at first. So when we're thinking about color and contrast, there's a couple of different ways to create contrast. So here we have a couple of these different color schemes again. Here's monochromatic. Here is more kind of analogous colors. Some of these look a little bit more kind of complementary. So here we think the contrast of light and dark. So these are going to stand out from each other based on how light and dark. Contrast of complements. So purple and yellow are on opposite sides of the color wheel, so they are going to create contrast with each other. This is simultaneous contrast, so having a couple of different varieties, so not only having the colors be different, but then also the darknesses, the intensity, contrast of warm and cool colors. So warm colors are the colors on the color wheel that are going to be like red, orange, and yellow. And then cooler colors are going to be green, blue, and purple. But within each of these colors, you can also choose colors that are going to be warmer and cooler. So let's say you had a green that's going to be closer to being yellow is going to be a warmer green, and then a green that's closer to blue is going to be a cooler green. And here we can actually see where some of these colors are going to look different depending on what is close to them. So the center color is actually the same color, but when it is compared to a different color, it can actually look quite different. And probably one of the examples that stands out the most, I would say, is this bottom example here. This red this is going to start to look like a slightly different color depending on what's next to it. I think this one also kind of stands out. So you want to think about those colors relationships and how they work when they are adjacent to each other. So there are a couple things to consider with print versus digital and how to optimize something for those. So serif fonts versus sans serif fonts. So serif font versus sans serif font. And I have linked on Canvas this nice graphic that goes into serif versus sans serif. So it's kind of looking at the difference between how legible they both are and how some fonts are better for print versus screen. So here they're both saying that they're illegible. Serif fonts are these ones that are going to have these kind of decorative end pieces. These actually make it a lot easier to read on a printed material because these help differentiate what letters. It makes it a lot quicker for people to read through these types of fonts. On screens, it's easier to read a sans serif font because on screens we have fewer pixels per inch. On a book it's called, or on a printed material, it's called dots per inch. But the idea is if you are looking on a screen, we are not able to have as many details per inch on these ends. And so the ends start looking quite blurry. And so it actually is a lot easier for us to read fonts without these decorative details on a screen. So this gives a couple of different suggestions, different examples, how you can work with these. So here we have a couple of different examples of fonts and then some suggestions. So it's much better to use a serif font for maybe a heading where the text is going to be smaller, you're going to see less of it, and then for you to use a sans serif font for a large body of text where your eyes aren't going to get as fatigued. It's the pretty much the opposite if you're working with printed material. And so with printed material, you might want to use a sans serif font and then a serif font for the text. And once we start working with printed style sheets versus screen style sheets, we'll look at how we want to switch these around. But here we have this nice conclusion of types of work. So saying if you're going to work with printed material, use serif. If you're going to work with web, use sans serif. So there's a nice little infographic to kind of go and explain everything. You want to also consider using wider fonts and open spaces. A lot of times you'll want to increase the line height. So the line height is how much space there actually is between different lines of text. So this one line of text, another line of text, increasing how much space is actually between these is going to make it easier for people to read. If these were too close together, it would be harder to read. So you'll usually have more of a taller line height than you typically would on printed material. And that's going to make it easier for people to read. Heavier strokes. So having a font that's going to be thicker. I know there's a fad that's kind of going on recently with having ultra fine fonts, and it's become really difficult to read a lot of texts. People like to choose them because they look really delicate and beautiful, but they just cause a more challenging user experience. So using fonts that are going to be thicker, easier to read. Taller X height. So X height is going to be the height of the lowercase letters, and the taller that this height is, the easier it is going to be for people to read. And a lot of web fonts have been optimized and created specifically with a taller X height, so that way they are easier to read. So you want to look for those types of fonts when you are working with text. Working with ems or percentages, this goes back to our idea of responsive design, where you want to have your sizes be flexible so they can change depending on what the user wants. This is a link to that infographic we looked at before. So a couple things to consider when looking at text. Be concise. People tend to skim information, so you want to make headings really easy to read quickly. Use common fonts, so that way you don't have to support a bunch of fonts on your website and people can read the information faster because they have the fonts on their own computers. Carefully choose your fonts. Fancier fonts are okay for headings, but not for paragraphs. Check your font size. Make sure that it works well for the type of platform that the font is being read on. Check the font weight. Check font color for contrast. Consider color blindness, whether or not your fonts might be hard to read in certain color combinations. Check your line length. So line length is how long the text spans across, and then also how long and how tall the text goes. So when we read, we want to read without having to move our heads. So there gets to be a point where if you are having to turn your head back and forth to read, it can be very uncomfortable. So this distance here is still a comfortable distance to read. If it was spanning across the whole monitor though, this might get to a point where it's a little bit trickier to read. If it was going all the way from this left side all the way over here, that would actually be quite hard to track. When you get done with one sentence, it could be hard to track. So in some cases, like this says bad and this is good, but at this size, it actually might, if you have this full screen, this might actually be pretty easy to read. So you want to think about the ratio of what the screen is that you're looking at. And then also, how far away is the person's head going to be from the device they're looking at? If somebody is looking at their desktop, they might be a little bit further away. versus if they are looking at a tablet or their phone, they might actually be a lot closer to the screen that they're looking at, and that can change their perception of what that line length is going to look like and what's going to be comfortable. Check alignment. Text and hyperlinks make sense. So you want to make sure that you're using words that make sense in your links, and then you also want to make sure that your links are obvious. Check spelling and grammar. And then here I have a couple of different links. A lot of times news websites are really good to look at for seeing how information is structured. They tend to have a ton of information that's all pulled in from other places using RSS feeds and other types of information. So I like to use those as an example. Here's anatomy of type. You don't have to have this memorized, but this kind of helps take a look at some of these things we talked about. So looking at these serif details, thinking about the X height. You can also think about how close some of these details get together, how far these might kind of stretch down into space. So if you had a very small line height and the lines were really close to each other, some of these might end up overlapping. So a couple words to be familiar with. Kerning. So here we can see kerning looks at the letters that are next to each other. Here these are too close to each other. These are too far apart. So a lot of times when people are working with graphic design where they're printing, they can actually go in and individually tweak these things, because the fonts we're going to be looking at and the text we're going to be looking at is all going to be digital and responsive. It's really difficult to go and tweak every little tiny thing because you just don't know how things are going to line up. And so it's better to do kind of general things, choosing the right kind of fonts, using choices that kind of affect the font overall, rather than being nitpicky and just kind of trying to change every little thing individually. Next we have tracking, which is looking at how close words are to each other, how they spread out from each other. Are they easy to read? Here between we, love, this is a little bit too far apart. It makes it hard to move on to the next one. These end up being a little bit too close, especially with the top here. And then we have leading, which this is essentially, this idea of leading has been pretty much replaced by the idea of line height. So a lot of times you'll see line height as a reference rather than leading, but it comes from the idea of how much lead used to have to be placed between blocks when information was being printed. So again, you can see the difference between how close, and depending on the fonts chosen, they can end up overlapping with each other or being too far apart. It can be easier to read on digital if we have a little bit more space. This is a little bit too close, but helps. So different types of typography. So these are all the same type of font. So if we take a look at this, typography is the art and technique of arranging type to make written language legible, readable, and appealing when displayed. Font family, the design of all characters comprised of a family and all its encompassing faces. So this would all be a font family. Typeface, the specific weight or instance of a particular family. For example, bold, italic, oblique are all typefaces. So down here we have hairline, ultralight, light. These are all different typefaces of this font family, but they are all going to be encompassed as the same family set. Here's some examples for different types of alignment. I'm going to suggest that you mostly stick to left aligned. We're going to take a look at some of these other ones. So commonly with printed material, especially newspapers, you will see that they're going to be aligned using justified. So here we just have justified in general, which is going to make sure that the text lines up on the left and right. This helps make a very solid type shape outline, but it can also create these rivers, which are the empty spaces between text that can become a little bit distracting and hard to read because it's evenly spacing out the text on each line so that way it is divided kind of evenly. A lot of times graphic designers will go in and manually kind of edit these to make them look better, but again, this is really impossible to do with responsive design on the computer because you'd have to account for every single possible way that someone might be viewing something. Here we have justified with last line centered. So it's kind of a variation of justified where it's figuring out what to do with this floating information. And then here we have justified with last line left aligned. So we're going to pretty much ignore justified because it doesn't work as optimally for web. So here we have left aligned, which means all of the text is going to line up on the left side. And then we have an uneven text line on the right. This is going to work well for responsive text because we can resize the column as needed. Right aligned is going to be the opposite, where the text is going to line up on the right and be kind of uneven on the left. Right aligned can actually work fairly well for information like on a navigation. You might have it right aligned, and because it's not going on multiple lines and it's just going across, it doesn't end up affecting your ability to read. Otherwise, it's actually quite hard to read right aligned because when you move back to the next line, it's hard to find your starting place. Centered is good for headings, but can be quite difficult to read when you are looking at large paragraphs of text, especially if the information ends up being quite different. Let's say you had an address or something and you had a really long street name but a really short phone number or something following it. You might go far across on one line and then have a really short line and then another long line, and it just becomes really hard to read when you have a bunch of information. So I'm going to suggest doing left aligned for your paragraphs, and then you can do left aligned or centered for your headings, maybe right aligned for your navigation. That's kind of up to you. So again, back to this idea of line length, thinking about how long your column is, how wide it is, and again, what is the user experience based off of what somebody's actually looking at. I took this picture from a video I found online, which this individual was trying to blow up a video game in order to play it on multiple monitors. What they didn't take into account was that one of the navigation menu items that they were going to need when the interfaces was going to be really small still in the bottom. And so from this distance, it actually becomes really difficult to see and is not an optimal experience. And so while the intention was to have this really nice experience being able to see from a very large screen, the rest of the design, because it wasn't built for this, ends up making it really hard to read because it's so small in comparison to that distance. So it's all about the relative ratio based off of how far you are and how far you have to move your head. But the idea is you don't want your user to have to move their head too much. You want to be able to read mostly with just moving your eyes. So different ways that you can create emphasis with your text: using italics, bold, underlining, adding color, typing in all capitals. A common trend right now is actually using all lowercase. A lot of brands are moving to having everything in lowercase, so that can also be a way of emphasizing. Creating different types of spacing, and then also indenting. And so when you're working with different types of fonts, you can use fonts that are web safe, that are commonly used. But you can also use the font face element in order to bring in fonts that are from other websites. So for example, we have this font here, which is being sourced by fontface.com. And so in your head section of your HTML site, you could add a font face font to your styles, and be able to bring in a font that is hosted from somewhere else. You could also add a font to your files that your server would have that would essentially give people that information. We'll look at that more in the future. So different types of font combinations. You can take a look at this link at w3schools.com. So here we have CSS web safe font combinations, commonly used font combinations. So when you're writing a font, you will often want to call up several different types of fonts, and you want to do them in order. So everything that is written will have a fallback option. So the first font would ideally be Times New Roman. If someone didn't have that font, then you would suggest that they should the browser should show Times, and then if all else fails, you want to use the default serif font that the browser has. So here's a couple examples of sans serif fonts. You could do Arial, Helvetica, sans serif. Here we have Arial, Gadget, sans serif. So finding fonts that are going to be similar to each other and work well. So Comic Sans, MS Cursive, sans serif, Impact, Charcoal, sans serif. So these are going to kind of by default complement each other quite well. Picking a color scheme. Try not to pick too many colors. 3 to 5 is a good number. You really don't want to use more than that. You want to consider shade, tint, tone, and hue. So shade being the darker value range, adding black to your colors. Tint is adding white to your colors. Tone is adding gray to your colors. And then hue is the color in general that you're picking. Color wheel. And then here we have those links that we looked at before. Graphics and multimedia, you want to make sure that you optimize your images and make sure your images balance quality and size. So if they are too large, they're going to make it very difficult for the page to load, but you don't want your images to be too low of quality. You want to provide alternative text to your images. So if somebody can't see the images or if they aren't loading quickly, there is alternative text that people can see instead. So that's going to be it for looking at the PowerPoint. So make sure you take a look at these different links. Most of these we went over in this video. These later ones we're going to take a look at in this next video on web publishing. So I want you to make sure you watch and take a look at the universal design links. And then also go to the discussion and post a link to a website that you feel like has poor design and user experience. And make sure you include a description of why you think so.